Look at a country like Nigeria. On paper, you see 37 billion barrels of crude oil, a booming tech sector, and the largest economy on the continent. But step onto the streets, and that wealth fractures against double-digit inflation and intense systemic friction. Analysts usually try to explain this gap through trade deficits or currency fluctuations, assuming that the right fiscal policy will eventually stabilize the environment. But those spreadsheets miss the actual root cause. The instability is driven by an ongoing crisis of the collective psyche. To understand why the system keeps breaking down, we have to stop analyzing the treasury and start diagnosing the psychological state of the citizens. This infographic breaks down the modern Nigerian citizen, showing how sustained pressure shapes measurable psychological profiles. Resilient dysfunction and ambitious anxiety are active survival responses. We also see hopeful anger, distrustful trust, and moral exhaustion. When public services fail, citizens build their own survival networks. These distinct profiles converge at a single point of failure: emotional disconnection. When trust between the people and the state dissolves, that psychological rupture acts as a persistent vulnerability in the national infrastructure, directly eroding the capacity for governance. To decode this trauma, Prince Dickson developed a framework called the Nigerian Emotional Map. The map traces this condition to its origins. The shift from pre-colonial autonomy to colonial rule established heavy layers of fear, anger, and defensive pride. Then came the euphoria of independence, but that optimism was jarred immediately by the sudden shock and devastation of civil war. Decades of military rule and corruption followed. The population was pushed into a state of cynicism, leaving millions feeling morally exhausted. This timeline shows us that the modern Nigerian psyche is not arbitrary. It is a measurable, cumulative trauma response tracking precisely across these historical eras. The emotional map applies principles from neuroscience to history. Sustained historical stressors act like continuous neural impulses. Over generations, those impacts solidify into the rigid, branching behavioral pathways we see today. But those pathways can change. We are currently in the awakening. Trust remains fragmented, but modern technological and democratic shifts are building a new foundation. By identifying these cycles as measurable trauma responses rather than inherent character flaws, the framework provides a starting point for intervention. If the trauma is hardwired through history, the solution must be just as structured. That intervention is called the conscious rebirth. It shifts the focus away from historical pain and toward actively engineering a healthier future. This multi-axis chart introduces the emotional nationality quotient, or ENQ. It gauges national health by mapping out a population's trust, empathy, and civic pride. A high GDP alone cannot maintain a stable society. Evaluating leadership and civic capacity through the ENQ tells us whether the people possess the emotional resilience required to support a functioning state. A country must measure, track, and build its societal empathy with the exact same rigor it uses to build bridges or power grids. To push these concepts into real homes, the framework uses a practical tool, the National Cake board game. The game teaches players that every bite of the national cake, every corrupt shortcut or selfish act, carries an immediate consequence. It uses play to rebuild civic intelligence. This micro-level engagement aims to disrupt the generational cycle of distrust directly at the source. You cannot legislate a nation into stability. True rebirth requires mapping the trauma and then actively healing the emotional intelligence of the citizens themselves.